The crack of the starting pistol split the morning air like a thunderbolt, and Virginia Bishop did not look back. She leaned low over the neck of her mare, Comet, her chestnut hair whipping free of its pins, her heart slamming against her ribs with a fury that had nothing to do with the race. It had everything to do with the man riding beside her close enough that she could hear the rhythm of his horse's hooves matching her stride for stride, close enough that, when she cut a sideways glance, she caught the hard line of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes, and the ghost of something that looked dangerous and honest all at once. Isaac Brooks had accepted her bet. Every other man in the Cimarron Valley had laughed. They had tipped their hats and made their jokes and walked away, because betting against a bishop was either suicidal or foolish, and most men out here could not afford to be either. Her father, Elias Bishop, ran the largest cattle operation between Santa Fe and Dodge City, and crossing him meant crossing God himself in this corner of New Mexico territory. So the men had laughed and the men had walked, and Virginia had stood in the center of the Redemption fairground with her chin up and her green eyes blazing, waiting. Then Isaac had stepped forward. He had said exactly 4 words. He had said, "Name your terms, Miss Bishop." And now they were flying across the red earth at a speed that made the cottonwoods blur, the morning sun blazing over the San Juan Mountains in the distance, and Virginia felt something she had not felt in years. She felt afraid, not of losing the race. She had never been afraid of losing a race in her life. She was afraid of what it would mean if she lost this one, because the terms she had named in a fit of pride, the terms she had stated loudly enough for half of Redemption, New Mexico, to hear, had been reckless in a way she could not entirely explain, even to herself. If Isaac Brooks won, she had promised to give him 300 acres of Bishop land along the Southern Creek. 300 acres her father did not know she had offered. 300 acres that sat on the exact boundary her father had been secretly negotiating to sell to the Santa Fe Railway Company. And if the railway found out that land had changed hands over a horse race, everything her father had built, every dark and complicated deal he had made in the past 2 years, would come crashing down on their family like a canyon wall. Virginia had made the bet not knowing any of that. She had made it because she was angry, because she was reckless, because she had been stifled and controlled and dismissed for the last time. She had found out about the railway deal only 3 hours ago, when she had overheard her father in his study talking to a man named Conrad Hale in a voice that made her blood run cold. A voice full of secrets and hidden motives. A voice that suggested the deal with the railway was not just a business transaction, but something far darker. Something that involved forged land titles and a betrayal of every homesteader family in the valley who had been promised their water rights would be protected. She had walked out of the house shaking with rage and ridden straight to the fairground. And now she was in a race she could not afford to win and could not afford to lose, riding beside a man she did not know and could not read, with the future of the entire valley hanging on the outcome. Comet surged ahead by half a length. Virginia felt the surge of pure physical joy that always came with speed, that clean animal pleasure of muscle and wind and earth, and she let herself have it for exactly 3 seconds before she heard Isaac's horse, a big roan gelding named Soldier. She would learn later, close the gap with a sound like controlled thunder. They were neck and neck as they rounded the curve toward the finish line painted in white lime across the red dirt road, and in that final 50 yards, Virginia made a choice. She pulled back, not enough for anyone to see clearly, not enough to make it obvious, just enough, a barely perceptible steadying of her hands, a subtle shift of her weight, that Comet came in second by a nose. Isaac Brooks crossed the line and pulled Soldier to a stop, and the small crowd that had gathered, a handful of ranch hands, 2 merchants, the blacksmith and old Mabel Prout who attended every public event in Redemption regardless of her age or the weather, erupted in surprised noise. Isaac turned Soldier around and walked the horse back toward Virginia, who was sitting perfectly still on Comet, staring at the finish line with an expression that nobody who knew her would recognize, because Virginia Bishop did not stare at finish lines she had just crossed second. Virginia Bishop crossed finish lines first and dared anyone to disagree. He pulled up beside her, close enough to speak quietly, and she finally looked at him. He was not celebrating. He was not gloating. He was watching her with those dark eyes, steady and unreadable, and he said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "You let me win." It was not a question. Virginia felt her breath catch somewhere between her throat and her chest. "You cannot prove that." "No," he said, "but I know what I saw." She held his gaze for a long, terrible moment, and then she said something she had not planned to say, something that came out of a place deeper than pride. "There are 300 acres of Bishop land on the Southern Creek that I should not have put into that bet. If you claim them, you will start a war in this valley that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with my father's secrets. I could not let you win fairly because I could not let you win at all." Isaac Brooks looked at her for a long moment. The dust settled around them. Somewhere behind them the small crowd was dispersing, already returning to their daily routines. The drama of the race filed away as a footnote. Only old Mabel Prout was still watching, sharp-eyed as a hawk, but too far away to hear. Isaac said, "Then tell me about your father's secrets." And that was where it truly began. They did not go back to the fairground. They rode south, toward the creek, because Virginia needed to see the land she had almost given away, needed to stand on it and understand what she had done and why. Isaac rode beside her without asking again. He seemed to understand, in that quiet way he had, that the story would come when she was ready, and that pushing would only close the door. The Southern Creek was beautiful in the October morning. The cottonwoods along its banks had gone gold, and the water ran clear and cold over flat stones, and the grassland around it was the rich amber of late autumn, dry but still carrying the memory of summer in its color. Virginia dismounted and let Comet drink, and she stood on the bank and looked at the mountains and tried to organize her thoughts into something coherent. Isaac dismounted too. He tied Soldier loosely to a cottonwood branch and sat on a flat boulder near the water and waited. The year was 1882. The Santa Fe Railway was pushing its lines through New Mexico territory with the relentlessness of something geological, reshaping the landscape and the economy and the lives of everyone in its path. For some people that meant prosperity. For others it meant displacement, ruin, the loss of everything they had built. The homesteaders in the Cimarron Valley had organized 2 years ago to petition for protection of their water rights, because they had watched what the railway had done in other valleys, diverting creeks, fencing off springs, leaving small farms to wither. They had elected representatives and drafted documents and believed, in the way that people who have no other choice believe, that they had secured a promise. Virginia's father, Elias Bishop, had been one of the loudest voices in that fight. He had stood up at the town meeting and called the railway barons robbers in silk suits, and everyone had cheered, and Virginia had been so proud of him that she had wept. That was 2 years ago. What she had overheard this morning in his study told a different story. Elias had made a deal, a private, hidden deal with Conrad Hale, who was not a local man but a land agent for the railway, a man with a gift for finding compromises that served the railway at everyone else's expense. The deal involved selling a portion of Bishop land that controlled the Southern Creek's headwaters. Whoever controlled those headwaters controlled the water rights for a significant stretch of the valley. And the homesteaders who had trusted Elias Bishop to stand with them would find their water slowly disappearing, diverted to railway construction camps, sold back to them at a price they could not pay. The betrayal of it was the kind that reaches into your chest and pulls. Virginia told Isaac all of this standing on the bank of the Southern Creek with the gold cottonwood leaves falling around her and the water running cold and clear at her feet. And when she was finished, she turned to look at him and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite categorize. It was not pity. It was not judgment. It was something more careful and more honest than either of those things. "Why did you make the bet?" he asked. "If you knew the land was complicated." "I did not know this morning," she said. "I found out after I had already made it. I went home to change out of my riding skirt before the race, and I heard his voice in the study, and I stood in the hallway and listened to 3 minutes of a conversation that undid 23 years of believing my father was a good man." Isaac was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He might still be a good man who has made a terrible decision." Virginia looked at him sharply. "That is a remarkably generous thing to say about a man you do not know." "I have made terrible decisions myself," Isaac said. "Most people have." She studied him. He was, she thought, about 28 years old. She would later learn he was 27, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of outdoor work, dark hair going slightly long over his collar, and those eyes that were either dark brown or very dark green depending on the light, impossible to settle on. He was not from the valley. She knew that much. He had appeared in Redemption 6 weeks ago, purchased a small homestead 3 miles east of town from a widow who was moving to live with her daughter in Albuquerque, and had been quietly going about the business of making it livable without attracting particular attention. The fact that he had been the only man in the valley to accept her bet had caught her attention in a way that unsettled her, and she was not entirely sure why. "Who are you, Isaac Brooks?" she asked. He smiled then, just briefly, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch for a completely different reason than it had during the race. "Someone who needed a fresh start," he said. "Same as a lot of people who end up in New Mexico territory." "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He stood from the boulder and walked to the water's edge, looking downstream. "I will tell you what I know about Conrad Hale, though, if that is useful." Virginia went very still. "You know Conrad Hale?" "I know of him," Isaac said carefully. "I came from Colorado. Hale worked a similar scheme in a valley outside Pueblo 3 years ago. He used a local rancher as his front man, someone respected, someone trusted, made him a private offer that looked good in isolation and was catastrophic for the community. The local rancher took the deal. The valley lost its water access. 3 homestead families lost their land within a year." He paused. The local rancher in Colorado did not know what he was signing until it was already done. Hale is very good at obscuring the full picture until the papers are signed. Virginia's hands had gone cold. "You came here because of Hale." Isaac turned to look at her. "I came here because I needed a fresh start," he said again, and this time she heard something underneath the words, some weight of history that he was not ready to share, and she chose, for reasons she could not entirely explain, to let it rest. "What I need to understand," she said slowly, "is how much my father understands about what he has agreed to, whether he is a victim of Hale's method or whether he knew exactly what he was selling." "The best way to find out," Isaac said, "is to get a look at the actual documents." It was a reasonable thing to say. It was also, Virginia immediately recognized, the kind of task that required either stealth, leverage, or a great deal of courage. Her father kept his important papers in a locked iron safe in his study, behind the map of New Mexico territory that hung on the eastern wall. She knew the combination because she had once watched him open it when he thought she was in the garden. She had never used that knowledge before. She had filed it away like a small, uncomfortable secret, the kind that proves you were paying more attention than you were supposed to. "If I am going to do something that could be considered spying on my own father," she said, "I would like to understand your role in all of this first. You are a stranger in this valley. You accepted a bet that no local man would touch. You have knowledge about Conrad Hale that is specific and detailed. I would like to know why you are here and what you want." The question landed between them with some weight, and Isaac met it directly, which she appreciated. He did not deflect or soften it. He looked at her steadily and said, "The man in Colorado who lost his valley to Hale's scheme was my uncle, Henry Brooks. He built his homestead over 20 years. He lost it in 6 months after the deal went through. He died of a broken heart, which sounds like a story but is the plain truth. He was dead within a year of losing the land, and the doctor said his heart simply gave out, but everyone who knew him understood the real cause. He paused. I am not here for revenge. I want to make clear that. I came here because Hale was here, and because I believed I might be able to do what my uncle could not do, which is understand what Hale is doing before he finishes doing it. I did not expect to get involved in a horse race. Virginia looked at him for a long moment. What she saw was a man telling the truth. She had grown up around men who lied with smooth facility and men who told the truth with awkward sincerity, and she had developed a reliable instinct for the difference. Isaac Brooks was telling the truth. Not all of it, there were still shadows in his history that he was keeping, but the part he had offered was genuine. All right, she said. Then we are working toward the same thing. He looked slightly surprised. You need the documents to understand what Hale has arranged, she said. I need them to understand whether my father is a victim or a collaborator. Neither of us can do this alone. She met his gaze with the directness that had intimidated half the men in New Mexico territory. Unless you have some objection to partnering with a woman. The corner of his mouth moved. I saw you ride today, Miss Bishop. I have no objections. They agreed to meet at the Southern Creek again that evening after dark, when Elias Bishop would be at his regular Thursday card game at the Redemption Hotel, a habit so fixed that Virginia could have set a clock by it. She would go to the study alone. That was non-negotiable, she said, because she was the one who knew where the safe was and how to open it. And bringing Isaac into the house uninvited crossed a line she was not prepared to cross. She would bring the documents to him at the creek, and they would read them together. It was, she acknowledged as she rode home alone, a peculiar kind of alliance. She had known this man for approximately 4 hours, most of which had been spent in a horse race and a conversation that had stripped away several comfortable assumptions about both her father and the valley she had grown up in. She did not trust him entirely. She did not distrust him either. She trusted the practicality of needing each other, and in the valley in 1882, practical alliances were often the ones that held. The Bishop Ranch house was a substantial building by territorial standards, 2 stories of adobe and timber, with a wide, covered porch and glass windows that her father had ordered all the way from Santa Fe at considerable expense, because her mother, before she died, had loved the way the light came through glass in the morning. Virginia had been 12 when her mother passed, and the windows had stayed clean and clear ever since as a kind of testament. She arrived home at midday and went through the motions of her afternoon, speaking to the cook about supper, reviewing the weekly ledger for the cattle operation, which she managed entirely on her own since her father had increasingly disengaged from the practical work of running the ranch. She kept her voice normal and her face composed, and when her father came in from wherever he had been and sat down to supper across from her, she looked at him and tried to reconcile the man she was looking at with the voice she had heard that morning through the study wall. Elias Bishop was 61 years old, broad-shouldered and white-haired, with the kind of face that belonged on a coin, square-jawed and authoritative, the face of a man accustomed to being right. He had built the Bishop operation from 30 cattle and a single sod house, and he carried the knowledge of that achievement in every line of his posture. He was not a bad man. Virginia had believed that her whole life, and she was not ready to abandon it without evidence. Over supper he mentioned the horse race, which surprised her. She had not been sure word would reach him so quickly. I heard you made a fool of yourself at the fairground this morning, he said, not unkindly. Some new fellow beat you on a roan horse. I ran Comet a good race, Virginia said. She was not quite fit enough. You offered Bishop land, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Virginia kept her eyes on her plate, 300 acres along the South Creek, the back section. Virginia, his voice was careful now, controlled. That land is not available. I did not know that, she said, which was true enough. The man did not press the claim. He said the race was not about land. Also true. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good, keep it that way. and he changed the subject, which told Virginia something important. He was not going to explain to her why the land was unavailable, which meant he was hiding the railway deal deliberately, which meant he knew it was something she would object to. The hiding was its own kind of betrayal. After supper, she waited. Her father left for his card game at 7:30, riding into town on his steady bay gelding. Virginia waited 15 minutes, then went to the study. The safe was behind the map, exactly as she remembered. Her hands were completely steady as she worked the combination, because she was the kind of woman whose hands were steadiest when the stakes were highest. The safe opened. She found the papers she was looking for in a folded leather folder, a set of documents written in a neat legal hand with a railway company header and 2 signatures at the bottom. Her father's familiar signature, and below it, Conrad Hale's. She sat down at her father's desk under the oil lamp and read them carefully. What she found was worse than she had imagined and better than she had feared, which was its own complicated kind of truth. The deal was real. Her father had agreed to sell a controlling interest in the Headwaters parcel to a holding company that was 3 layers of obscuring language down, the Santa Fe Railway. The terms were financially generous to Elias, more generous than he probably understood was significant, because people who pay too much for something always want too much in return. The document was dated 2 weeks ago and gave a 60-day window before the transfer was finalized. 60 days. That was something to work with. But the thing that changed her understanding of her father was a handwritten letter tucked into the back of the folder. It was from Elias to Conrad Hale, drafted but apparently not yet sent, and it read in her father's blunt handwriting. Hale, I have been reviewing the attached maps, and I find that the parcel boundary you have described includes access to the Mendez Spring and the Ortega Creek Junction. I do not believe I understood this fully when I signed. I require your assurance that the existing water agreements with the neighboring homesteaders will be honored under the new ownership. If you cannot provide this assurance, I intend to consult a lawyer before the transfer is finalized. Her father was having doubts. He had not been fully informed. He was not entirely comfortable with what he had signed. Virginia sat with that letter for a long time, feeling the complicated texture of relief and anger and love all twisted together. Then she folded everything carefully back into the folder, took the documents she needed, and relocked the safe. At 10 o'clock she was at the Southern Creek. Isaac was already there. He had a small fire going, just enough to read by, well screened by the cottonwoods from anyone passing on the road. He had also, she noticed, brought a blanket and a pot of coffee, which struck her as both practical and thoughtful in a way that she filed away without knowing why. She handed him the documents and watched his face as he read them by firelight. Read carefully and thoroughly, not rushing, which she appreciated. When he finished, he set them down on his knee and looked up at her. The 60-day window, he said. Yes, she said, we have until the end of November. And your father's letter. He does not know everything Hale is doing, Virginia said. But he is not entirely innocent either. He signed without fully understanding, and that is partly because he did not want to look too closely at something that was paying him well. She paused. That is a kind of willful blindness that has its own moral weight. It does, Isaac said, but it is also fixable. He looked at the railway documents again. These are not yet filed with the Territorial Land Office. Until they are filed, the transfer is not legally complete. Hale will file them sometime before the 60-day deadline. If your father withdraws consent before that filing, the deal falls apart. Getting my father to withdraw consent means getting my father to admit he made a mistake, Virginia said, which requires telling him everything I know, including how I know it. Isaac looked at her steadily. Are you prepared to do that? Virginia thought of the unsent letter in her father's handwriting. She thought of his voice at supper, careful and controlled, hiding something that was already troubling him. She thought of 23 years of believing he was a good man, and the evidence she now had that he was a flawed one, which was a different thing. I will go to him tomorrow, she said, but not alone. I need someone who can speak to what Hale did in Colorado, someone who has evidence beyond my word. If I go to him alone, he will dismiss it as sentimentality. He has a particular blindness when it comes to trusting his own daughter's judgment over a man in a suit. I will come with you, Isaac said. He will not welcome a stranger in his house. No, Isaac agreed. But that is a smaller problem than letting the deal go through. They sat on either side of the small fire for a while after that, the coffee between them, the creek running its quiet commentary over the stones. The night was cold the way New Mexico Territory nights are cold completely and without apology, a sky full of stars so dense they looked crowded. Virginia pulled her coat closer and looked up and felt, unexpectedly, something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt as though she was in the right place at the right time, which was remarkable given that the right place was a creek bank in the dark, and the right time was the middle of a crisis. You were not going to claim the land regardless, she said, even if you had won fairly. Isaac looked at the fire. No. Then why accept the bet at all? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because you were standing in the middle of that fairground with your chin up and your eyes full of something that looked like righteous fury, and everyone was laughing and walking away. And that seemed wrong. Virginia looked at him. The firelight moved across his face in an irregular way that made him look older and younger at different moments. That is a strange reason to enter a horse race. I have entered races for stranger reasons, he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost humor but landed closer to honesty, and she found she liked it. Tell me about the strange reasons, she said. And he did. Not all of them, not the darkest ones, but enough. He told her about growing up on his uncle's homestead in Colorado, about learning to ride before he could reliably walk, about his Uncle Henry and the particular kind of patience Henry had had for both horses and people, the kind that had made him everyone's first choice in a crisis. He told her about leaving the homestead at 18 to work as a hand on the cattle drives coming up from Texas, about 5 years of the kind of work that either breaks a person or builds something hard and useful in them, about drifting back to Colorado to find the valley changed, and the homestead sold and Henry old, and diminished in a way that hurt to see. He told her about the year after Henry died, when he had spent some time in a dark place that he described only as not doing well, and she understood from the way he said it that it had been more than grief, that something had broken in him that had taken considerable time to repair. What repaired it? She asked. Work, he said. The physical kind. And eventually the sense that there was something useful I could do with knowing what had happened, something that meant Henry's loss was not entirely without purpose. He looked at the fire. I am not a crusader. I want to be clear about that. I'm just a man who arrived in the right place at the right time with the right information, and whether I use it or not is a choice I have to make. You have already made it, Virginia said. Yes, he said. I suppose I have. They parted at midnight. Virginia rode home under the dense stars and let herself in through the back door and went to bed without lighting a lamp, lying in the dark and thinking about the shape of what tomorrow would require. The confrontation with her father, the presenting of evidence, the asking of a proud man to acknowledge a mistake before the mistake became permanent. She had done difficult things before. She had managed the Bishop cattle operation since she was 19 years old, when it became clear that her father was better at the large vision than the daily detail. She had negotiated with cattle buyers who thought a woman at the table was a joke, and had made sure they left understanding their mistake. She had survived a failed engagement at 20 to a man named Garrett Holloway, who had wanted to marry the Bishop Ranch rather than Virginia Bishop, and had told her so with a bluntness she had respected even as it stung. She had been through drought, and a cattle sickness that took 40 head in 3 weeks, and a late spring flood that damaged the north pasture fencing so badly it had to be entirely rebuilt. She was 23 years old, and she was not afraid of difficult things. But she was afraid, lying in the dark, of what it would mean to look her father in the eye and say, I know what you have done, and I need you to undo it. She was afraid because she loved him, in the complicated way you love someone who has disappointed you, without entirely destroying your faith in them. She fell asleep near 2 in the morning and dreamed of a horse race where the finish line kept moving. Isaac Brooks arrived at the Bishop Ranch at 9 the next morning, which was earlier than he and Virginia had discussed, and which spoke, she thought, to an overnight decision to simply get on with it before either of them had time to reconsider. She met him on the porch, and they stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the clear morning light, the kind of light that shows you exactly what you are looking at. He had dressed carefully for this, she noticed. Clean shirt, jacket, hat in his hands rather than on his head. It was the kind of care a man takes when he understands the importance of first impressions and is willing to do the work. "He is in the study," she said. "How was your night?" "Complicated," she said. "Yours?" "The same." He looked at her steadily. "You do not have to do this today if you need more time." "If I need more time, I will use the time to talk myself out of it," Virginia said. "Let us go." Elias Bishop was at his desk when they came in, working through a stack of supply invoices with the methodical focus he brought to all financial matters. He looked up when the door opened, and his expression went through several stages in rapid succession: surprise at Virginia's entry without knocking, recognition of a stranger, assessment of the stranger, and a settling into the careful neutrality he used when he was uncertain of the territory. "Virginia," he said, "who is this?" "Isaac Brooks, sir," Isaac said before Virginia could answer. He was calm. Not submissive, not aggressive, simply calm, the way a man is calm when he knows what he is there for and has made peace with the difficulty of it. "I am the new owner of the Callaway homestead east of town. I apologize for the intrusion." Elias looked at Virginia. "What is this about?" Virginia pulled the chair in front of his desk and sat in it, which was not something she normally did in her father's study. She sat in it deliberately, because the gesture said, "I am not here as your daughter seeking permission. I am here as a participant in this conversation." Then she put the documents on his desk. He looked at them for a long moment without touching them. Then he picked them up and began to read, and his face went very still in the way that faces go still when they are working hard to stay controlled. When he put them down, he did not say anything for nearly a minute. "You went into the safe," he said. "Yes," Virginia said. "That is a significant breach of trust." "I know," she said. "I did it because I heard your conversation with Hale yesterday morning, and what I heard frightened me enough that I needed to see the documents to understand what was actually happening." She kept her voice level and her eyes on his face. "I am not angry that you made a business decision without consulting me. I am frightened that you may not understand the full impact of what you have signed." Elias looked at Isaac. "And what is your involvement in this, Mr. Brooks?" Isaac explained. He spoke clearly and without embellishment, describing what he had witnessed in Colorado, the scheme Hale had used, the local rancher who had been used as a front without full information, the consequences for the homesteader community. He mentioned his Uncle Henry with brevity and precision, not for sympathy, she understood, but because it was relevant evidence about Hale's pattern of operation. Elias listened with the absolute stillness of a man who is hearing something that confirms a fear he has been carrying alone. When Isaac finished, Elias was quiet. Then he looked at Virginia with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and it took her a moment to identify it. It was shame. "I sent Hale a letter 3 weeks ago with concerns about the headwaters boundary," he said. "He told me I was misreading the map. He said the neighboring homesteaders' water rights were protected under existing territorial law." "They are not," Isaac said. "The holding company will apply for a variance on the territorial water rights as soon as the land transfer is filed. It is the third step in the process. By the time the variance is filed, the original deal will be 3 steps removed from anything traceable to you, and the homesteaders will have no obvious recourse." Elias put his hands flat on the desk and looked at them. Virginia watched her father and felt the complicated weight of this moment. The man who had raised her alone for 11 years, who had taught her to ride and to negotiate and to understand the language of land and cattle, sitting across from the evidence of his own fallibility with nowhere to put it but on the surface of his desk. "There is still time," Virginia said quietly. "The transfer has not been filed. If you withdraw consent before it is filed, the deal is void." "Hale will push back," Elias said. "He may threaten legal action." "He has nothing to threaten with," Isaac said. "The contract contains a withdrawal clause that is standard in these railway land agreements. I expect it is in there as a formality that Hale assumes people will not read closely. But it gives you the right to withdraw consent for any reason before the territorial filing." He paused. "If you would like me to review the exact language, I am comfortable doing that." Elias looked at him with the measuring look he used on men he was deciding whether to trust. Then he looked at Virginia. "You brought him here because you trust him." "I brought him here because he has information we need," Virginia said. "Whether you trust him is your decision." Her father was quiet for another moment. Then he pushed the documents across the desk to Isaac. "Find the withdrawal clause," he said. What followed was 2 hours of careful work around Elias Bishop's desk, Isaac finding the legal language, Virginia reviewing the homestead maps to identify the exact headwaters parcel and its relationship to the neighboring properties, and Elias drafting the withdrawal letter to Hale in terms that were precise and final and entirely without apology. When the letter was done, Elias read it over twice and signed it with the deliberate pen stroke of a man committing to a course of action. Then he looked up at Isaac Brooks, who was sitting across from him with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has been careful to be useful without being intrusive. "You came to my daughter first," Elias said. "She found the information herself," Isaac said. "I provided context." "That is a diplomatic answer. It is also the accurate one." Elias looked at Virginia. Something passed across his face that was complicated and warm and slightly rueful. "You are more like your mother than you know," he said. "She also had a way of finding out things and taking action before she consulted me." It was, Virginia thought, the most honest thing he had said to her in years. The letter was sent to Hale that afternoon via the Redemption postal agent, with a copy retained and witnessed by the town's justice of the peace, a small, careful man named Abbott who understood the significance of what he was witnessing and said nothing beyond the required legal language, which was exactly right. The homesteader community would not know, for some time, how close they had come to losing their water access. That was perhaps a mercy, or perhaps a withholding. Virginia was not certain which. Conrad Hale received the letter 2 days later. He came to the Bishop Ranch in person, which Virginia had expected and had prepared for by ensuring that both Isaac and the justice of the peace were present in the parlor when he arrived. Hale was a small man, impeccably dressed for territory standards, with the kind of smooth manners that were always slightly too smooth, like a surface that had been polished to hide the grain of the wood beneath. He tried persuasion first. He was very good at it. He made the deal sound not just reasonable but patriotic, spoke about the railway's role in connecting communities, in building a prosperous territory, in creating opportunity for the next generation. He spoke about it with such fluency that Virginia could see exactly how her father had been convinced, and that clarity made her almost respect Hale's ability even as it deepened her contempt for his methods. When persuasion did not work, he moved to subtle threat, mentioned the railway's relationships with territorial officials, the importance of not being seen as obstructionist. This was a miscalculation, Virginia thought, because her father's expression had been cautiously cooperative during the persuasion phase and became entirely closed during the threat phase. Elias Bishop did not respond well to threats. He never had. When Hale finally left, an hour after he had arrived, driving his rented buggy back toward town with the tight, controlled movements of a man who is furious and not showing it, Virginia stood on the porch and watched him go and felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, exactly. More like the relief that comes when you have stopped something bad from happening, which is a quieter feeling than winning and possibly more satisfying. Isaac stood beside her on the porch. close enough that she was aware of him the way you are aware of warmth in a cold room. "He will try again," Isaac said. "Not here, but elsewhere in the valley." "I know," Virginia said. "But elsewhere in the valley is a different problem for a different day." He looked at her sideways. "You are very good at compartmentalizing." "I am very good at knowing which fight to fight today," she said. "It is not the same thing." He smiled then, and this time it was not the brief, careful thing it had been the first time. It was a full smile, unguarded, and it did something to her sense of equilibrium that she had to actively manage. "I should go," he said. "I have fencing work at the homestead. The North Pasture line has been giving me trouble." "I know something about North Pasture fencing," she said, without entirely meaning to say it. He looked at her. "Do you?" "We rebuilt ours entirely 2 years ago after a spring flood. I could tell you what we found worked." She was aware that she was extending the conversation past its natural end, and that she was doing it deliberately, and that he knew she was doing it deliberately, and that he appeared to have no objection. "I would appreciate that," he said. They walked around to where the horses were tied and stood in the mid-afternoon sun talking about fencing for 20 minutes, which was not really about fencing at all, and they both knew it. Over the following weeks, Isaac Brooks and Virginia Bishop settled into a pattern that neither of them formally acknowledged or deliberately designed. It was the kind of pattern that develops between two people who have reason to see each other regularly, and who keep finding that the reasons multiply. He came by the Bishop Ranch with questions about local suppliers, local water sources, the subtleties of running cattle in this particular stretch of territory. She rode over to his homestead to see how the fencing work was progressing and found herself staying for hours, helping in a practical way with the work, because it was not in her nature to watch someone else do something when she could be useful. She met his horse, Soldier, properly, and found him to be an excellent animal, steady and intelligent, with a broad chest and good sense. She told Isaac this, and he said he has never lost a race he tried to lose, and she looked at him and felt the warmth climb into her face, which was not something that happened to Virginia Bishop. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he said. "From the moment you pulled back, I suspected. You are too good a rider to have lost that race by accident. I told you afterward." "Yes," he said, "you did." They were standing in his barn, and the afternoon was late, the light coming through the west-facing door in long amber lines, and Virginia was holding Soldier's bridle, while Isaac checked the gelding's near foreleg, which had been slightly tender after a morning of work on rocky ground. It was a domestic, ordinary moment. It was also, she realized, the most comfortable she had felt in another person's company in a very long time. "I was angry the morning of the race," she said. "I wanted to do something loud and pointed and possibly ill-considered. A horse race seemed like a measured response, given that," he said. "It was," she said seriously, and he laughed, really laughed, and the sound of it in the quiet barn was the nicest thing she had heard in longer than she could easily measure. November came in over the mountains with the first real cold, and the valley turned the gray-brown of late autumn, the grasses flat and pale, the mornings sharp with frost that melted to mud by midday. Virginia and Isaac rode the Southern Creek line together one afternoon to check that the headwaters parcel was properly documented in the county survey records, a task that required 2 people because the terrain was rough and the survey markers were in poor condition. It was practical work, and they did it practically, and somewhere in the middle of it, without anything being formally decided, Virginia understood that she was happy. It arrived not as a declaration but as a quiet fact, the way you might notice on a particular morning that your breath has stopped hurting, not the moment it stopped, just the absence of the pain. She was happy. In the middle of a difficult autumn, with her father's secret untangled but not entirely resolved, with the future of the valley still uncertain, with 100 practical problems ranging from cattle feed for winter to the still unfiled homestead paperwork that Isaac was behind on, in the middle of all of it, She was happy in a way that had a specific location and a specific cause. She did not say this out loud. She was not a woman who said things before she was certain of them. But she looked at Isaac as they rowed back along the creek in the late afternoon, his profile against the pale November sky, and she thought, "Here is something I did not plan for and cannot control, and I am not certain that I want to." It was a thought that would have frightened her considerably 2 months ago. Now it felt like the truth, which was always better than the alternative. It was her father who brought things to a head, which surprised her entirely. She came home one evening in late November to find Elias in the parlor, which was unusual. He normally spent his evenings in the study, and he looked up from the book he was reading, which she could tell by the way he was holding it that he was not actually reading, and said, "Isaac Brooks has been spending a great deal of time here." "He has," Virginia agreed, sitting down. "He is a good man," Elias said, which was not what she had expected him to say. She looked at him. "Yes, I believe he is." "He came to me last week," Elias said. "While you were in town with the Jennings cattle account, he came and asked to speak with me privately." Virginia's heart did something entirely involuntary. "And he told me about his uncle," Elias said. "About Henry Brooks in the Colorado Valley. More than he told you initially, I think." Her father set down his unread book and looked at her with the same expression she had recognized the day of the documents, honest and slightly rueful. "He told me he had arrived in this valley intending to stop what Hale was doing, and that he had not expected to find himself concerned about what happened to the people here beyond the practical goal. He was quite plain about it. He said he was concerned about you, and he wanted me to know his history before I heard it from someone else." Virginia sat with this for a moment. "What history?" "He spent time in a bad way after his uncle died," Elias said. "He said he was in Kansas City for a year, that he drank too much and made poor decisions, and that there is a period of his life he is not proud of. He said he came out of it on his own, that he had been sober and building for the past 4 years, and that he was not ashamed of the period, but he was honest about it." Her father looked at her. "He told me this himself, Virginia, without being asked." Virginia thought of Isaac saying, "I have made terrible decisions myself. Most people have." She thought of the darkness he had described obliquely, the year after Henry died, that he had called not doing well. She thought of the way he carried it, not as a secret as it turned out, but as a truth he preferred to offer on his own terms rather than have discovered. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him that a man who can rebuild himself from a bad period is more reliable than a man who has never been tested," Elias said. "I also told him that my daughter is not easy, which I mean as a compliment, and that any man who intends to be in her life should understand what he is asking for." Virginia looked at her father for a long moment. "You did not ask me first." "No," he said, "I did not, because sometimes a father needs to do the thing that is useful rather than the thing that is proper." He picked up his book again with the air of a man who has said what he came to say. "I thought you should know the conversation took place." She went to Isaac's homestead the next morning. It was cold enough for her breath to show, and the frost on the grassland caught the low sun and held it in 1,000 small points of light. She rode Comet at a canter and arrived to find Isaac working on the barn roof, replacing a section of boards that had been inadequate to begin with. He saw her coming across the pasture and climbed down from the roof with careful speed, and she swung down from Comet, and they stood in the frosted yard looking at each other. "You told my father," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because I did not want there to be anything between us that was discovered rather than offered," he said. "Because I think you deserve to know who you are dealing with, and your father deserved to know that I am not someone who arrived here with a clean history and uncomplicated motives. I came here with grief and a purpose and a past that has rough patches in it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." Virginia looked at him for a long moment. The morning was very quiet. Somewhere across the pasture, a meadowlark was making an argument against the cold. "I am not easy," she said. "My father apparently told you this." "He did," Isaac said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "He also told me it was a compliment." "He was right," she said. I am complicated and I run the ranch and I make bets I should not make and I go through locked safes when the situation requires it. I have a failed engagement in my history that ended because the man in question wanted the land more than he wanted me, which took me 2 years to stop being angry about. I have opinions about cattle management and fencing and water rights and railway company ethics, and I am not going to stop having them because someone finds them inconvenient. I am aware of all of this, Isaac said. I need you to be aware of all of this, she said, because I am not going to be simplified into something more convenient, not by anyone. Virginia, he said quietly, I have been aware of exactly who you are since the morning you stood in the middle of a fairground with your chin up and dared the whole valley to meet you on your terms. I did not step forward because I thought you were simple. I stepped forward because I thought you were remarkable. She looked at him and felt the thing that had been building for weeks arrive at some final point of clarity. Not a revolution, not a surprise, but a recognition. The way you recognize something you have known for a while but not yet named. You still owe me a real race, she said. A fair one. He looked at her steadily. Name your terms, Miss Bishop. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, which was not the kind of thing Virginia Bishop had done first before, but she had decided, somewhere between her father's parlor and this frosted yard, that waiting for permission was a habit she could afford to break. He kissed her back with a completeness that suggested he had been waiting and was glad to stop. They were standing in his yard with the frost melting around their feet and the meadowlark making its argument somewhere in the distance. And Virginia thought that this, too, was a kind of race won, not by speed or strategy, but by the willingness to step forward when everyone else was stepping back. The weeks after that were the best she had experienced in a long time, and she could say that with precision because she was a woman who paid attention to her own experience and knew the difference between good times and exceptional ones. They were exceptional in the particular way of two people who have moved through a crisis together and come out the other side knowing each other in a way that takes most couples years to achieve. The crisis had been the accelerant. What burned was real. She spent time at his homestead, and he spent time at hers, and their presence in each other's work was practical and comfortable, and shot through with a kind of electric attentiveness that she had not previously understood when she had read about it in the novels that occasionally made their way to the Redemption General Store. She understood it now. It was the feeling of someone else in a room making the room better, making you more yourself rather than less, without even trying. Isaac was building the homestead into something real. The house was sound, the fencing excellent. She had helped with a significant portion of it and was proud of the work. He had acquired 20 head of cattle at the fall livestock auction in Cimarron and was building a modest operation with the methodical care of someone who has learned not to rush things. He was good with his hands and patient with animals and had a gift for reading the land, understanding where water would pool in spring, where grass would hold in drought, where wind would push hardest in winter. Virginia watched him work and felt, repeatedly and with increasing depth, the particular richness of respecting someone you love. It was different from just loving someone. It was the thing her failed engagement to Garrett Holloway had entirely lacked. Garrett had been handsome and charming, and she had been 20 years old, and the lack of respect had taken her 2 years to identify and name. But once she had, the word had been definitive. She respected Isaac Brooks in the full sense of the word, his judgment, his character, his honesty, the way he engaged with difficulty without drama, the way he held his past without being imprisoned by it. Her father, for his part, had undergone a quiet transformation since the morning of the documents. He was more present in the daily operation of the ranch, more willing to consult Virginia rather than make unilateral decisions, and there was a new quality to his silences. They had become thoughtful rather than closed. He was, she thought, working through something important about what he had nearly done and what it said about the years of decisions that had led to it. She did not press him on this. She trusted the process. He also, increasingly, treated Isaac Brooks with the directness he reserved for people he had taken seriously, asking his opinions about cattle market conditions, about territorial politics, about the railway situation across the territory. Isaac answered these questions thoughtfully and without putting himself forward, and Virginia watched her father decide he liked him with the satisfaction of someone who had expected this outcome, but was glad to see it confirmed. December came in and the valley went a full winter, cold and clear and beautiful in the way that desolation can be beautiful when the light hits it right. The mountains were white above the tree line, and the creek ran lower and slower under its occasional skim of morning ice, and the sky was the deep blue that only the high desert sky can produce, a blue that looks painted on rather than natural. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-December, Isaac rode over to the Bishop Ranch and asked Virginia if she would like to walk with him, which was not his usual manner of arriving, and suggested some formality of purpose. She said yes, and they walked out to the south pasture, the frozen grass crunching under their boots, the mountains ahead of them immense and white. He stopped at the fence line where the south pasture met the land above the creek and turned to look at her, and she could see that he had organized something carefully, that he was going to say it in a particular way, and that it mattered to him to say it correctly. "I came to this valley with a specific purpose," he said, "and no plans beyond it. I intended to address what Hale was doing and then figure out the rest of my life from that point. The homestead was a practical step, not a destination." He paused. "You were entirely unexpected." Virginia looked at him in the cold December light, the mountains behind him and the frozen grass around them, and the whole of the valley spread out below in its winter quiet. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said, "and I do not make declarations before I have thought them through completely. I have thought this through completely." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small, and she looked at it and felt her breath go quiet in her chest. It was a ring, plain and silver, with a small garnet that caught the winter light in a deep red glow. "I had it made in Cimarron," he said, "by the silversmith there. I described what I wanted and he made it. It is not what you would find in a city jeweler, but it is honest work." It was, she thought, exactly right, honest work, no pretension, real in the hand. "Isaac," she said, "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "I am asking because you are the most fully realized person I have ever met, and because the idea of building something permanent here with you is the first thing that has felt entirely right in more years than I can easily count. I am asking because I love you in a way that makes me better, and I believe you know that I mean that without flattery." He paused again. "I am also aware that you will have opinions about the timing and the practical arrangements and possibly about the ring, and I am prepared for all of those opinions." Virginia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The ring is perfect. The timing is right. The practical arrangements can be discussed." She stepped forward and took the ring from his hand and slid it onto her own finger, which was the kind of action that told him everything before she said the word. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Isaac Brooks, I will marry you." He kissed her there in the south pasture with the mountains watching and the frozen grass crackling softly under their feet, and it was, Virginia thought, an entirely appropriate place for this particular answer, out in the open, in the light, with nothing hidden. She told her father that evening. Elias looked at her for a long moment, then stood from his chair and crossed the room and embraced her, which he had not done in years, not since she was 12 and her mother had died, and he had held her in the kitchen with no words available to either of them. When he stepped back, there was something on his face that was simpler and more genuine than anything she had seen there recently. "Good," he said. "That is the right choice." He looked at her with the clear eyes of a man who has recently been reminded of his own fallibility and is trying to live more honestly because of it. "Your mother would have liked him." Virginia thought of her mother, who had been as practical and direct as Virginia herself, who had run this house with the same energy Virginia ran the ranch, who had died too young and left a gap that had never quite closed. "I think so too," she said. The wedding was set for March, which gave them the winter to plan and the early spring to execute, and which gave Isaac the time to make the homestead fully ready for two people rather than one. Virginia was involved in this process with the full intensity she brought to everything, which meant that by February the homestead was considerably more organized than it had been, and Isaac was learning, with appreciation and occasional amusement, that being in a partnership with Virginia Bishop meant that her involvement in a project went all the way to the foundation. "You moved the entire kitchen layout," he said one evening, looking at the changes she had implemented with the help of 2 ranch hands from the Bishop operation. "The original layout made no sense," Virginia said. "The stove was in the corner furthest from the water supply. It would have driven me to distraction within a week. I cooked perfectly well in that layout for 4 months. You cooked beans and biscuits in that layout for 4 months," she said. "The bar is notably low." He looked at her with the expression she had come to identify as his version of being entirely charmed by her, which was different from being agreeable or entertained. It was the look of someone who is genuinely glad to be exactly where they are. "You are not wrong about the beans," he said. She had also, with her father's enthusiastic agreement, arranged for a section of the south fence line between the Bishop land and the Brooks homestead to be relocated, giving Isaac access to a small natural spring that would significantly improve his cattle's water situation in dry summers. It was a practical gift and an honest one. She had the land, and he needed the water, and they were going to be married, and the fence line had always been slightly arbitrary anyway. When she told Isaac about the fence adjustment, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had moved him and he was deciding how to express it. "You did not need to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the nature of something freely given." He looked at her. "Virginia, do not make it sentimental," she said briskly. "It is a practical fence adjustment that benefits both operations. Write it up as a property easement with Abbott and let us move on." He laughed, and the look on his face was the kind that stays in a person's memory as a reference point for what happiness looks like in another person's face. The wedding took place on the 14th of March, 1883. In the Redemption Community Hall because the small church was under repair after a December storm had taken a section of the roof, and the hall was where the community met for the things that mattered: dances and elections and funerals, and now this. The hall was decorated with early spring wildflowers that Virginia had found beginning to push up along the creek bank, yellow and white and the palest possible blue, and the Redemption community turned out with the wholehearted goodwill that communities produce for events that feel genuinely right. Old Mabel Prout was there in the front row, which surprised nobody. She had been at the horse race. She had, Virginia suspected, watched the whole story from the beginning with the attention she gave everything, sharp and clear and entirely unsentimentalized. Virginia wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, with the garnet ring on her right hand until the ceremony moved it to the left. She walked down the hall between her father and the empty space where her mother would have been, and she felt both the loss and the fullness of the moment simultaneously, which is the nature of important days. They carry everything, not just the present. Isaac was at the end of the hall with the Redemption Justice of the Peace, standing very still in the way he was still when something mattered enormously, and when she reached him and he looked at her, she saw on his face the same recognition she had felt in the frosted yard months ago, not surprise but confirmation, the naming of something already known. The ceremony was brief and honest. They said the words they meant and meant every word they said, and when it was done, standing in the flower-decorated hall with the community of Redemption around them, Virginia thought, "Here is the thing about beginnings that start in crisis. They give you the truest possible picture of what you are beginning with." She knew Isaac Brooks's dark past, his grief, his year of poor decisions, his purpose in coming to the valley. She knew his patience and his honesty and his laughter, and the way he looked at her like she was a continuing revelation. He knew her temper and her stubbornness and her talent for running things and her complicated love for a father who had nearly made a catastrophic mistake. They had no illusions about each other, which was the rarest and most valuable foundation there is. After the wedding, the celebration went on into the evening with the kind of joyful energy that redemption saved for its best days. There was music. A fiddle player named Garcia from the southern part of the valley, who could make a fiddle say things that bypassed the mind entirely and went straight to the feet. There was dancing, and food brought by the community in the communal way that was one of the genuinely good things about territorial life, and the voices of people who were glad of a reason to celebrate. Elias Bishop danced with his daughter 3 times, which was 2 more times than he had danced at any occasion in at least a decade, and he did it with a kind of rediscovered lightness that suggested the past few months had given him back something he had misplaced. Virginia watched her father and felt the last of the February's complicated feelings resolve into something simpler and warmer. Isaac danced badly but enthusiastically, which Virginia had suspected from the beginning and which she found deeply endearing. She told him this while they were turning in a circle that bore only a passing resemblance to the waltz everyone else was executing, and he said, "I should have mentioned this before the wedding," and she said, "It would not have changed my answer," and he pulled her slightly closer, and they finished the dance in a way that was entirely their own. They settled into the life they had been building toward across that winter. 2 operations now coordinated as one. The Bishop Ranch and the Brooks homestead linked by the easement spring and by the shared management of the South Pasture, by Virginia's experience and Isaac's methodical building, and the combined energy of 2 people who work well together, not because they are identical, but because they are complementary. Virginia continued running the Bishop cattle operation, and Isaac ran the homestead, and they made decisions about both together with the easy practicality of a partnership that had always felt more like inevitability than coincidence. She was still direct and occasionally formidable, and always more right than was comfortable. He was still patient and steady, and more perceptive than he was given credit for. They argued about specific things and resolved the arguments with the same directness they brought to everything else, and the making up after a disagreement was, Virginia privately thought, one of the better arguments for occasional disagreement. Spring came to the valley in the slow way it always did, pushing up through the mud and the last of the snow in fits and starts, the creek running high with melt, the grassland going green from the bottom up, the air changing its quality from the clean sharpness of winter to the complex alive smell of growth. Virginia rode the South Pasture line in the early spring mornings and watched the land come back and felt it as a personal thing, the way people feel land they have known their whole lives. The Conrad Hale situation resolved itself quietly, as these things sometimes do. The Territorial Land Office received, in late February, a detailed complaint about Hale's land acquisition methods, a complaint that had been filed by a coalition of Cimarron Valley homesteaders, organized with some background assistance by Isaac Brooks, who had been careful to stay out of the front of it, but had provided the legal knowledge and the historical documentation from Colorado that made the complaint credible and specific. The Territorial Land Agent, a man named Reyes who had been appointed under the first Democratic administration of the territory and had a genuine interest in protecting homesteader rights, took the complaint seriously and opened an inquiry. Conrad Hale did not return to the Cimarron Valley after that. Whether the inquiry reached any formal conclusion was a matter that moved slowly through territorial bureaucracy, but the practical effect was immediate. The railway's land acquisition efforts in the valley shifted to a different agent using different methods, and while the fight over water rights was far from over, the immediate threat to the Cimarron Valley's homesteaders was substantially reduced. Isaac heard this news with the kind of quiet satisfaction that was its own form of emotion deeper than triumph, more settled. Virginia watched him receive it and understood that it was a closing of something for him, a completion of the purpose that had brought him to the valley, and that the completion did not leave a gap but a space that was already filled. "Your uncle would be glad," she said. "Yes," he said, "I think he would." In the first summer of their marriage, on a hot July morning when the valley smelled of sage and dry grass, and the mountains shimmered at their edges in the heat, Virginia told Isaac that they were going to have a child. She told him simply and directly, in the manner she told him everything. Standing in the kitchen, she had reorganized and watching his face go through the unguarded sequence of emotions that she had come to love, the initial stillness, the processing, and then the arrival of something warm and certain, and entirely without reservation. He crossed the kitchen and held her, and she let him, which was not always her natural response to demonstrations of emotion, but which felt, in this case, exactly appropriate. When he asked, "February," she said, "the doctor in Cimarron is sure," he pulled back to look at her face. "Are you well?" "I am extremely well," she said, with the directness that meant she had already thought through the relevant concerns and arrived at this conclusion. "I have also already spoken with the doctor about what is and is not advisable through the different months, and I am not going to stop riding entirely until the 7th month, regardless of what anyone says, because a woman who does not ride is a woman losing her mind, and that is not good for anyone." Isaac looked at her with the expression that meant he found her entirely extraordinary. "I would not dream of suggesting otherwise." "You would absolutely dream of suggesting otherwise," she said. "And you will, and I will explain the doctor's actual words, and we will reach the same conclusion through discussion, so I am simply expediting the process." He laughed, and she laughed too, and the summer morning went on around them in its hot, bright, ordinary way. Their son was born in February of 1884, during a snowstorm that kept everyone at the ranch for 3 days and gave the whole occasion a quality of isolation that Virginia, in retrospect, preferred. She had her father and Isaac, and the Bishop Ranch's longtime cook and housekeeper, a capable woman named Rosa who had attended more births than she could count, and who managed the whole proceedings with calm authority. Virginia managed it the way she managed everything, with the part of herself that did not allow fear to become paralysis. The birth was hard, as first births often are, and Virginia was very tired at the end of it, and the first cry of the child in the snowstorm silence of the ranch house was the most remarkable sound she had ever heard in her life. Isaac was at her side, where he had been throughout, his hand in hers, and when Rosa put the child in Virginia's arms, he leaned down to look at this new person with the same expression Virginia had seen on his face 3 times now. The one that meant the arrival of something real that he had not quite let himself fully anticipate. "A boy," Rosa said, "a strong one." "Henry," Virginia said immediately, looking at Isaac. She had decided this privately several months ago. She had not mentioned it until now, partly because she had not known whether it would be a boy and partly because she had wanted to see his face when he heard it. His face confirmed that it was the right choice. He said her name softly, just her name, and she understood everything it contained. Henry Isaac Brooks grew up in a household on the border between 2 ranches that were functionally one operation, with a mother who could outride everyone in the valley, and a father who ran the south pasture with the methodical patience of someone who was in it for the long term. He grew up with a grandfather who told long stories about building a cattle operation from nothing, who was also teaching himself, in his later years, to do the work of amends, to the homesteader families who had trusted him, to his daughter who had deserved more honesty than he had offered, to the memory of his own wife who had always known he was better than he sometimes chose to be. By the time Henry was 2, Virginia had recognized, with the attentiveness she brought to all her important observations, that her husband had built something in the Cimarron Valley that had nothing to do with his original purpose in coming there. He had built a reputation as someone fair and reliable, as someone who knew land and water and cattle, and the complicated territorial laws governing all 3, as someone who would tell you the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. People came to him with problems, and he helped when he could, and the help was always practical and honest, and without the expectation of reciprocal obligation. She told him this one evening in late 1884, when Henry was sleeping and the night was cold and clear outside, and they were sitting by the fire in the homestead house that was fully their own, the kitchen reorganized to proper efficiency, the walls hung with maps and the occasional painting, the whole place carrying the quality of being genuinely inhabited by people who were glad to be there. "You have become indispensable to this valley," she said. He looked up from the book he was reading. "That is an overstatement, Isaac," she said, with the tone that indicated she was not overstating anything. "The Mendez family came to you last month about their water boundary dispute. The new homesteader families who came in this fall, 3 of them, have asked you specifically for guidance. Abbott mentioned that you have sat in on 4 of his legal consultations in the past 2 months. As an observer," he said, "as the person whose judgment everyone values," she said, "you could formalize that. There are options in territorial law for Virginia," he said. "I am just noting that. I know what you are doing," he said. "You are planning my career." She looked at him with absolute composure. "I am noting a professional opportunity that appears to align with your demonstrated strengths." "You are planning my career," he said again, with the expression that indicated he found this endearing and somewhat inevitable. "Someone needs to," she said. He put down his book. "I will think about it," he said, "on the condition that you also tell me what you want, not for the ranch or for your father or for the valley, for yourself." She considered this, which was not something she was often asked in such direct terms. What she wanted for herself, separate from the practical operation of a life well organized. She turned it over in her mind and found an answer that surprised her slightly with its simplicity. "This," she said, "exactly this. The ranch running well, Henry growing up in a place worth growing up in, you hear, and building and honest about everything." She looked at him across the firelight. "And maybe 1 or 2 more children eventually, when the time is right." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across and took her hand, the one with the garnet ring that had been made by a silversmith in Cimarron on the specific instructions of a man who had walked into the Redemption Fairground on an October morning and stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. "That sounds," he said, "like exactly enough." It was, of course, more than enough. It was the kind of life that does not announce itself as significant, but is the kind that accumulates meaning not in large dramatic events, but in the daily texture of work done honestly and love given without reservation, and the steady presence of people who have chosen each other fully. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1886, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara, after Virginia's mother. Clara arrived with the same efficient certainty that characterized her mother's approach to most things, and was, from the beginning, an entirely different temperament from her brother. Where Henry was patient and observational, Clara was loud and immediate and gloriously certain of her own importance, which delighted Virginia in a way that Isaac pointed out was deeply unsurprising. Henry was by this time a serious, dark-eyed child of 2 who had developed his father's gift for stillness and his mother's gift for seeing things exactly as they were, and who received his sister's arrival with the measured interest of someone who has been told something is coming and is now assessing whether the reality matches the description. Elias Bishop, who by this time was fully and without reservation the best version of himself, the version that the first 2 years of Virginia's life must have known before the pressures of building a fortune had started to compress him, became a grandfather with a wholehearted abandon that Virginia found both touching and occasionally excessive. He told Henry long and elaborated stories about the early days of the cattle operation, stories that grew in length and drama with each telling in the way that good stories do. He taught him to identify the different grasses of the pasture by feel and smell. He sat on the porch with Clara when she was fussing and sang the same 3 songs in rotation, slightly off-key, until she settled. The southern creek ran clear and cold through 4 seasons, over the flat stones that had always been there, past the cottonwoods that went gold in October and bare in December and green again in April. The headwaters parcel that had nearly been sold to the railway was properly surveyed and documented as Bishop family land, held in common interest with the homesteader families who depended on the water downstream, a formal arrangement that had been put in place under territorial law with Isaac's assistance and Abbott's careful legal hand. Conrad Hale was never seen in the Cimarron Valley again. The territorial inquiry eventually produced a formal censure of his methods, which was insufficient by any honest reckoning of the damage he had done in other valleys, but which created a record that made his methods harder to employ elsewhere. It was not justice, exactly. It was what was available, and Virginia had learned to distinguish between those two things while keeping them from conflating into one. In the spring of 1887, Virginia and Isaac rode the south pasture line together the way they had ridden it so many times, checking fence, checking grass, checking water, checking all the things that required regular checking on a working ranch. They rode side by side on Comet and Soldier, who were both showing their age now in the gray at their muzzles, but who were still sound and willing. And the morning was warm, and the valley was green, and the mountains were blue and distant above their snow line. At the corner of the south pasture where the fence turned toward the creek, Virginia stopped Comet and looked out over the land she had grown up on, the land that had almost been sold and hadn't, the land that belonged to a valley that had come close to losing something essential and had not quite lost it. Isaac stopped Soldier beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned to look at him. The morning light was on his face, and he was 40 years old in 6 months. She counted these things. She always counted these things, and he looked, she thought, exactly right. Exactly as he had looked on every day she had known him, and better than he had looked on all of them, because familiarity with someone honest is not erosion but deepening. "I am thinking about the morning of the horse race," she said. "The morning I stood in the fairground and made a bet I should not have made for reasons I barely understood, and every man in the valley walked away." "Every man but one," he said. "Every man but one," she agreed. "I have thought occasionally about what would have happened if you had not stepped forward, if I had stood there with my chin up in my fury and no one had met me." "You would have found another way," he said. "You always find another way." "Maybe," she said, "but it would have been a lonelier way." She looked at him steadily. "I'm very glad you stepped forward, Isaac Brooks." He looked back at her with the expression she would never entirely be able to describe, the one that had no equivalent in any language she knew because it was specific to him, the expression of a man who is entirely present, entirely without reservation, entirely certain of where he is. "So am I," he said. "Every morning since." They rode back along the creek together, side by side, through the green valley in the warm morning, and the cottonwoods were beginning to leaf out along the water's edge. And somewhere ahead of them the ranch house stood against the New Mexico sky with the glass windows catching the sun the way they always had, the way they were always going to. And inside it, 2 children were waking up to another ordinary, extraordinary day. Virginia Bishop had bet she could outride any man in the Cimarron Valley. She had been right. She could. She had also, by the accident of righteous fury and a bet made too big on the wrong morning, found out something she had not known she was looking for, that there is a different kind of strength than the kind that rides alone, that a partnership built on honesty and crisis and mutual respect is not a compromise but a completion, and that the man who steps forward when everyone else walks away might be doing it for entirely unexpected reasons that turn out to be the best reasons of all. Only one man had tried. He was the right one. And the valley, the red and gold and green valley with its contested water and its hard-won peace and its spring wildflowers and its winter stars. The valley went on, as valleys do, carrying all of its stories in the land and the water and the ordinary extraordinary weight of lives fully lived.